And it is now, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my very serious pleasure and privilege to welcome the Prime Minister of France, who is joining us for the first time in Munich. May I offer you a warm welcome, Monsieur le Premier Ministre. Since we have so little time this morning, I am not going to make a long introduction. I'm simply going to ask you to take the floor and to address this audience. Please.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen.
The sound of French. Well, maybe not really. Well, too bad. Mesdames et messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, I cannot say whether the world is a more uncertain and insecure place than 50 years ago. I wasn't here 50 years ago, and that's one of the reasons why. But it's also because I believe that the world is an insecure and uncertain place by nature. By nature, this rings true for the future as well. That is always uncertain too. However, I'm sure that the threats we face today are different and are new challenges because they have changed and evolved. And I know that from experience. I was born in 1970. And I have lived through the equilibrium of terror, what people call the end of history, and the hope for a peace dividend. And then a multipolar world came about where new centers of power and new power balances evolved, especially in Asia. I witnessed violence through terrorism geared against and looking against our democracies all across the globe, but also here in our own countries, in the Western world and Europe. I would like to leave the stock taking at that, but what surprises me today, time and again, is the increase of imbalances, the growing imbalances and lack of equality, the development of asymmetric conflicts, the changing forms of states and governments, the failing states that evolve, the evolving development of regional conflicts leading to migration movements, and the blatant ignorance towards the rules of international togetherness. These are threats to my generation that also threaten my country, that are looming above France too. And they're not far away from us. They are here. They're present. They are not part of any history book, as we have seen in Europe many times. We already know a lot of threats. But now we were hit in our hearts in Europe, in Barcelona, Stockholm, Berlin, Brussels, etc. The heart of 500 million Europeans was hit. And all those were hit by those attacks that are friends of Europe. In May of 2017, the French held a presidential election, and in that election they made a decision in favor of change and renewal for an openness towards the world. They decided to take on responsibility when it comes to how nations deal with each other. And the people also made a clear decision in favor of Europe, and not for any kind of Europe, not only for a Europe with a big internal single market. It was a decision in favor of a Europe that can protect them from the detrimental developments of globalization against. It can protect them from threats that I just laid out. It was a clear decision that the President and I try to implement on a day-to-day basis in France and also outside of the French borders. Against the backdrop of these imbalances, we want to change France, to make it stronger. We want to make France more credible through the right strategies. Thus, we want to address all the challenges that are scattered all across the globe. And this strategy rests on 3 pillars. First of all, there is the military pillar. As you may be aware, France decided to spend 2% of its GDP by 2025 in defense expenditure. That is very important because we do that in an environment of strong limitations to public spending. But this is a necessary, indispensable effort that we also enshrined in a law. Thus, we can employ our armed forces that are involved on many fronts right now, and we want to equip them properly with that because they pay with their lives sometimes in the Middle East, in the Sahel zone, but also in France in the form of the security operation called Opération Sentinelle that is to protect our homeland. The second pillar of our strategy is public development assistance. We want to increase the amount spent on that to 0.55% by 2022, focusing mostly on Africa. We do that in the context of a migration crisis that, we have to be honest with ourselves, Europe was not prepared for. This is why we implemented an international action plan with Germany, Italy, and Spain in order to eliminate the root causes of migration where they originate from. Of course, we cooperate with the transit and originating countries in that regard. It is about sharing our knowledge and expertise. France can make a direct contribution to the security of Europe and its partners in the East because we deployed a combat aircraft and land forces to the Baltic countries. My first visit abroad was to the Baltic countries. It was an important, meaningful gesture to demonstrate our solidarity with those countries. And we did that after the annexation of Crimea. And today this commitment continues in Lithuania. We participate in a force together. We provide a battalion together with Germany. We are also engaged in Africa, in the Middle East, and there we try to fight the threats to European security. I would also particularly like to highlight our commitment in the Sahel zone, commitment by Mauritania, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad. The threats I mentioned hit us right in our center, into our hearts. And if I say us, I do not refer only to the people of France, and I do not address you today as a Frenchman, but as a European citizen who was born in France. I also speak to you as a Frenchman who, in his youth and childhood, traveled to other countries. I used to live in Germany for a while. The cities I just mentioned earlier are cities we know very well. Germans, Italians, French, we all know these cities. We travel to those cities. We used to live there maybe. We maybe have friends and family there. We feel at home in those cities, all of us. So all of Europe is basically facing itself. And at the same time, we're facing a wall. We're with the back against the wall. And at the same time, European defense cannot only be a topic for theoretical seminars, it's a practical necessity to discuss it. And this necessity, this need, needs to be addressed with 3 demands. We need to fulfill 3 requirements. So France and Germany indeed need to intervene in a very practical sense, because otherwise Europe will remain a topic of theoretical considerations. Europe is not to replace the United States or other states, but we were able to create Europe through the states that are members now. I'm not a fan of Leo Trotsky, but I think he always had a good sense for good phrases, and I would like to refer to him. If Europe is not interested in war, the war will start getting interested in Europe. And the second demand we need to meet is this: Europe needs to get used to interdependencies. That is not easy. Until now, it looked like this. The world followed Europe's beat, and now we live to the beat of the tensions in the East, in Asia, in the Middle East, and we also feel the tensions that come up somewhere else in the world. So if there's Arctic coolness and cold, we feel that too. Or if there's a conflict in the Korean Peninsula, we feel that too. Europe cannot leave the project of the new Silk Road to China alone. And depending on what rules apply to this project, it could be a project of cooperation or a project of leadership and hegemony or superiority. Europe needs to stick to its values that it advocates, and at the same time we need to react once these values are under attack. Europe gained one experience. We had to deal with many lives that were claimed. We have deep cuts and wounds on our territory that were given to us while we did not defend our values. This is why we stand up against fake news, against cyber threats and other threats. That brings me to a third decision. It's a decision for action. The European Union has already launched a number of measures that the Lisbon Treaty allows for. We just heard about the axes. We heard about means that are now being provided for a Europe of defense. We want a joint strategy which is an indispensable prerequisite for a European defense. We want the Europe of defense to be created. We want to shape it. And we should be ambitious together in spite of political chaos that we live through, despite Brexit. We need to build on the community of our peoples, on our relations, our close ties that tie us to the UK and to other countries, and we want to further strengthen those ties. We hope that in a Europe of defense, we can benefit from our cooperation with NATO as well. A strong NATO also means a more solid European Union of defense, just as a reasonable, responsible EU also is an added value for NATO. I said it in French. Maybe I should have said it in Norwegian, but you understood me just right. France wants to take on an active role in the transatlantic alliance, in the alliance that has nuclear as well as conventional forces available. France stands by but its allies. In the face of those major challenges, I want to say that my conviction is this. I have a conviction of a European. It's a conviction of solidarity based on a long history that was also a tragic history, but it's still based on these old values and on a history that also had wonderful aspects. It's a conviction that is rooted on a world in change and founded on the belief that Europe is more than a strong community of values, but a community of fate. We want to use this fate, this destiny, and approach it together and shape it. And since we're in Munich, I would like to quote a renowned author and soldier who was a soldier of the French Legion, a Foreign Legion. He passed away 20 years ago, Ernst Jünger, and I would like to quote him. He said in an essay about peace called Peace, he said, Europe has an unbelievable force of resilience that it has shown in its history, and it has a legacy that is not only a museum of intellectual developments and consideration, but it shows that it can inspire the people of today too, and let us be inspired by that, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Mr. Prime Minister, we have a few minutes for questions, and I'm looking around if there are any hands up. There is a hand up, but let me ask a first question. When one looks at the published French plans for your defense budget, and when you compare that to the German draft coalition paper. From your point of view, are these German plans good enough for a serious implementation of une union de défense?
Si je comprends bien votre question,
I hope I understood your question correctly. So do you ask me as a prime minister to have an opinion on the coalition agreement, agreement negotiated in the coalition? So you want me to say something on that here in Germany right now? That's a good question. Well, please allow me to respond to that by not addressing the German plans, but rather focusing on the French plans. Our efforts are, as I believe, indispensable. We laid this all out in a military program initiative. We have a military budget, and we put this into a piece of legislation together with the defense minister, and our parliament will pass it. And it covers the time period from 2019 to 2023 and 2023, and we will invest 100 billion euros here. And we want to catch up and make up for the cuts that we've seen in the past years. Thus, we want to be capable to act in all the major 5 areas that are of concern to our armed forces at the moment. It is important to us to remain credible in defense matters. We want to meet the demands and requirements people have towards us. These are not nice words that I'm saying. No, we are in an insecure and dangerous world.
One hand up there. Please identify yourself and try to be brief. We're really running out of time. Charles.
Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. Mr. Philippe, in the previous session, Mr. Kurz said that in order to strengthen itself, the EU should focus on, quotes, its Christian and Jewish mentality. Do you agree, and do you think such comments help to integrate minorities in countries such as your own?
And we'll go straight to the lady over there.
Ja, thank you. Heike Hensel, Fraktion Die Linke im Deutschen Bundestag.
I have a question regarding the threat of your President Macron, who said he would conduct retaliation operations should gas attacks by the Syrian government be conducted. Don't you think that this is a very dangerous form of self-justice and escalation in this region? If we set up these red lines, and doesn't that contribute to the erosion of international law that we witness when states internationally give themselves the mandates in order to conduct military operations and interventions? Mr. Gabriel talked about strengthening international law. So can you maybe say a few things about that? How can I understand President Macron's statement? Could you maybe repeat the first part of your question? I think the Prime Minister didn't have the headset ready when you started talking. So it's about the statements and the threat by President Macron to conduct retaliation operations should gas be used in attacks in Syria. And my question was, isn't that a form of self-justice that is not part of international law? That's not only applies to France, but also for the United States. But I believe that we need to strengthen international law, and still we see that states act by giving themselves their own mandate for intervention operations. Well, thank you very much for giving me the time to put on my headphones. It's been a while ago since I lived in Germany, and my German is a bit rusty. Now, off to your questions. Multilateralism and adhering to international law. This is a very basic, fundamental question. It's a question that France has a clear opinion on. And we have made clear decisions regarding that. We made decisions in favor of multilateral action. You also addressed the framework in which President Macron wants to act as long should there be any gas attacks on the Syrian population, on the Syrian people with nerve gas, for example. The coalition in Syria fights terrorism. It is a fight that indeed actually shows results. It is a fight that already now and will probably also in the future brings and may bring about that we need to resort to means that are actually not acceptable, and where France knows that these actions are not acceptable. But what do we do if something is not unacceptable? We lament it? Or do we try to limit the unacceptable activities? France made it very clear what we think about that. And now regarding the question of our values, the values that support and are the basis of Europe and that should guide the defense sector. It's a question that in France we do not face for the first time. This question came up when we discussed a constitution in France and the content of a European constitution, as well as the values that we want to use, that we already claim as our values and that would have deserved being mentioned in a European constitution. And the traditional answer is simple. A French prime minister will always tell you this: we know our common history. We know how the European civilization came about. We know how crucial religions have been in the creation of these values and in the construction of this community of interests and destiny. France decided to be a laicist state. France does not go back to religious values that, of course, it respects in its policies. And I would also like to say, while talking to you, that I feel very French right now. Thank you very much. Thank you for the great delegation. Oh, did I say President? Well, Prime Minister, of course. Thank you, Prime Minister, not President.
I want to thank you personally. I also want to thank you for bringing along a very good-sized French delegation. Your defense minister spoke yesterday at the opening, and I think that was an important signal of a joint Franco-German resolve in foreign policy, in defense, and in other areas. So let me thank you again very, very much. And as you leave, I would like to invite the Prime Minister of Turkey to prepare himself for his speech, which is going to be the next item. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.